Hello, everybody. This is Micah History 2, and welcome to the History of Canada, Part 2. So, I'm going to pick up where we left off. With France gone, Great Britain was now the new master of Canada, starting a new period in Canadian history. Though at first the British tried to suppress the French culture, in 1774 they allowed them to keep their culture. This, however, made the people in the British colonies further south angry, and they declared war on Great Britain the next year, starting the American Revolutionary War. Also in 1774, Juan José Pérez Hernández, a Spanish explorer, became the first European to explore British Columbia. The new rebel army tried to invade Canada, but the Americans failed miserably, and this was the moment which decided whether Canada would join the United States, who declared independence the next year in 1776. Though Canada was safe from conquest, the United States still won the war in 1783, and many loyalist Americans fled to Canada. Many of these immigrants, along with Scottish immigrants, went to southern and southeastern Quebec, Nova Scotia, but especially New Brunswick, which was split off from Nova Scotia as a new colony. They turned these formerly French-speaking areas into English-speaking areas. 1783, Spain colonized British Columbia and southern Yukon, founding Nootka, making it the first country to colonize British Columbia and Yukon. But the next year, it was shared between Spain and Great Britain, which now controlled land from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In 1791, Quebec was split into English-speaking Upper Canada and French-speaking Lower Canada. 1795, Nootka was abandoned. In 1812, the War of 1812, what an original name, began, and the United States once again invaded Canada, once again confident that they would easily crush the Canadians. However, they got wrecked and completely failed in invading Canada. In fact, Canadian soldiers even burnt the White House, although don't tell that to the Americans or else they get butthurt. The war ended in 1815 with no changes, but Canada was never again invaded by the United States. Strangely enough, though, only 3 years later, in 1818, Columbia was colonized by both the United States and the United Kingdom, with most of British Columbia being part of it. This was also the time of the second main wave of immigration to Canada, the Great Migration of Canada. British had been worried about how the 300,000 French people in Quebec and southern Rupert's Land and the 200,000 American people in southern Upper Canada, Nova Scotia, southeast Lower Canada, and New Brunswick made up the majority of the Canadian population, fearing another American invasion. Therefore, they encouraged immigration from the British Isles after the War of 1812. In 1820, New Brunswick split from Nova Scotia. In 1825, the rest of mainland Canada was colonized, founding the colony of Rupert's Land and making it the first colony in the Northwest Territories. In 1837, two rebellions broke out in both Upper and Lower Canada, but they were soon crushed. In 1839, Victoria Island was colonized. In 1840, Upper and Lower Canada united to become Canada. In 1846, the modern borders of Canada were finally created when Columbia was split between the United States and the United Kingdom. Now the United Kingdom was the master of Canada and owned all of it apart from some islands. In 1848, Somerset Island was colonized, and in 1850, Devon Island was colonized. In 1850, the Great Migration of Canada ended, but it changed Canada from a French Catholic to an English Protestant area. During this period, 480,000 English and Scottish people immigrated to Canada, and especially after the Great Famine from 1845 to 1852, 320,000 Irish people immigrated, most of the immigrants going to Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. In 1851, Bathurst Island was colonized, and in 1852, the rest of Baffin Island, as well as Melville Island, were colonized. And the next year, Prince Patrick Island and Banks Island were colonized too. In 1864, plans began to be made to unite all 8 British colonies in Canada, which were the colonies of Canada, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, Rupert's Land, Hudson Bay, New Brunswick, and Columbia. By this time, Canada had a population of 3 million. The 1864 Quebec Conference and Charlottetown Conference were held to decide how this would happen. Then, once the government was figured out, the London Conference of 1866 was held. In 1866, British Columbia and Vancouver Island united. On July 1st, 1867, the British North America Act was passed, uniting the colonies of Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, into the autonomous colony of Canada, with its capital at Ottawa. This doesn't mean that Canada was independent, even though that's what most people think, but it actually became a lot more autonomous. It's ended the period of British domination, started the period of post-Confederation Canada. In 1869, the Red River Rebellion by descendants of French people and First Nations, called Métis, broke out. It was soon crushed, but a new province for the Métis, Manitoba, was created. Meanwhile, to get the other 6 colonies to join it, Canada promised to build a railroad that would stretch all across Canada. This caused Hudson Bay and Rupert's Land to join in 1870, and they became the Northwest Territories. British Columbia to join in 1871, and in 1873 Prince Edward also joined. Now only Newfoundland was not part of Canada. In 1876, Keewatin split from the Northwest Territories. In 1881, the United States colonized Ellesmere Island. Meanwhile, the Canadian Pacific Railway began construction in 1881. However, in 1885, the Métis once again rebelled, starting the Northwest Rebellion, and declared Saskatchewan's independence, but Saskatchewan was quickly reconquered. But this caused the railway to be built more quickly and was completed months later. This was the last time a war was ever fought in Canada. In 1895, Canada's population reached 5 million. In 1898, Yukon was separated from the Northwest Territories, and in 1901, Norway colonized Axel Heiberg Island, starting its Arctic colony. In 1902, Norway also took Ellesmere Island from the United States and colonized Ringnes Island. In 1905, Alberta and Saskatchewan were separated from the Northwest Territories, which also retook Keewatin. In 1907, Newfoundland became autonomous. Between 1911 and 1913, a third wave of immigration, mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe, happened, but in 1914, World War I broke out, ending the post-Confederation period and starting the post-war period. In 1917, Borden Island was colonized, making it the last place in Canada to be colonized. In 1918, the war ended and women were given the right to vote. In 1929, the Great Depression hit Canada, and the next year, Canada took Norway's colonies. Finally, on December 11th, 1931, the most important event in Canadian history happened when the Statute of Westminster was passed, making Canada independent. And the newly independent country now had a population of 10 million. In 1939, World War II began, the first war in which Canada fought. This also ended the Great Depression. After it ended in 1945, a fourth wave of immigration, still mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, happened, mostly to Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. In 1949, Newfoundland decided to join Canada, completing Canada's expansion. In 1950, Canada joined the Korean War against North Korea, China, and the Soviet Union, which ended in 1953. In the 1960s in Quebec, the Quiet Revolution happened, where the Catholic Church was severely weakened and Quebec became more secularized and modernized. It also saw increased Quebecois nationalism. In 1965, Canada changed its flag, and in 1969, English and French became the official languages. In 1967, Canada reached a population of 20 million. During the 1970s, the first wave of Canadian immigration happened after the ban on the fifth wave, happened after the ban on non-European immigrants was reversed. In 1974, Canada helped to make peace between Greece and Cyprus and Turkey in the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, and in 1990 joined the Persian Gulf War against Iraq that lasted until 1991. It also joined the Rwandan Civil War against Rwanda, Zaire, and France that lasted until 1994. In 1992, it joined the Somali Civil War and the Bosnian War, which both ended in 1995. Also, if you want to know about the Bosnian War, watch the video I made about history of Republika Srpska. In 1993, it joined the Croatian War of Independence against Croatia. And in 1998, Canada's population reached 30 million. It also joined the Kosovo War against Yugoslavia. In 1999, Nunavut separated from the Northwest Territories, and in 2001, Canada joined the war in Afghanistan. In 2011, it went to war against Libya in the Libyan Civil War, and in 2014, the war in Afghanistan ended. And finally that year, it joined the war against ISIS, which is still going on. And that's it. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Check out my new channel, The Traditionalist. And don't forget to follow me on Vimeo. Goodbye.